Welcome back everyone for the fifth presentation on the simulation aesthetics when ceramics imitate other material. The subtitle is Illusion and Limitations. The simulation aesthetics, like all aesthetics, is found historically all over the world since the beginning of ceramic history, more or less 30,000 years ago. And here are some examples from Egypt, where we have lotus and papyrus models made in ceramics for funerary purposes to be put as offering in tombs, as are this roll of cloth and this throw stick. And the fact that those objects are ceramics is not irrelevant, because ceramics is a very permanent material. It will last for eternity, which makes sense as a funerary offering in a tomb for deceased people. So as I said, you find examples of simulation aesthetics everywhere, all over the world. It's very common. This is two examples from Japan, from the Aniwa culture. An armor imitating metal, probably leather as well, and a wood boat, a miniature wood boat. In Han Dynasty China, we have this example of a faux bronze vessel. So poor people who could not afford bronze would have imitation bronze in ceramics as offering in their tomb, and a miniature stove, which would have been originally made out of bricks and metal. We skipped to the 1500s and the Della Robbia family, starting with Luca Della Robbia and Andrea and then Giovanni later on. And I believe the Della Robbia family were the first to use plaster molds to make ceramic forms, and make plaster molds from live material, fruits and pine cones and cucumbers in this case, to make reproductions of them in ceramics and insert them into their beautiful retablos. So this is, I believe, a first. And of course, plaster mold making is an extraordinary appropriate technique for the simulation aesthetic. This is an example of Andrea Della Robbia's work, where you see the use of that technique to imitate other material in ceramics in this extraordinary work. Also, more or less at the same time than the Della Robbias in Italy, but this time in France a bit later, we have the work of Bernard Palissy, who may also have been at the initiation of the use of plaster and plaster mold making and clay press molding in plaster molds in the history of ceramics. I believe he was the first in France anyway, and we've discussed this work previously. We'll probably discuss it again in other contexts because it's very important work. And what I like about his work is the psychological nature of the tableaus that he composes with various animals and plants and shells recomposed in strategic ways in his work. As I've discussed before, but I will remind you again, sometimes there is reversal in his work, like the piece on the right, where the shells which we expect to be white are blue, and the water which we expect to be blue is white. And those kinds of reversal is something I discuss periodically in the reading as well, and I bring up here again because it is quite a central aspect of ceramic conceptualization to work with reversals. The way, for example, a live animal becomes a dead one, an animal becomes clay, becomes ceramics. Those are form of reversals as well that I am discussing here. So the work of Bernard Palissy is quite extraordinary. He was also a great inventor of glazes and all around Renaissance man. And in the 19th century, his work was reappraised, and there was a revival of his work in France and then all over Europe, basically. And he was rediscovered after being basically neglected for a few centuries. And this is an homage to Bernard Palissy, all in porcelain, made at Sèvres in the 19th century. So here we have a faux painting in ceramics, faux marble, faux metal, faux all kinds of material, combined together to create this quite extraordinary thing. Bernard Palissy was also at the initiation of what we call Saint-Porcher ware in France, which are imitation of metal prototypes. So he was looking at metal prototypes, both in the form and the decoration, and translating metal prototypes in ceramic with the use of plaster molds again. And that's quite innovative. In the United States, we have followers of Palissy like George Hoare, where working with snakes and imitating all kinds of material in his ware as well. And also the Kilpatrick brothers working at Anna Pottery in Illinois, and again working with snakes a lot in their work. So snakes are a very popular thing in ceramic history. We find them again in all kinds of contexts, basically all over the world. And you have here an example from Portugal, an example from Sèvres, France, in porcelain from the 1830s. And then fishes and plants of all kinds are also very popular. This is an example from Chelsea. I'm showing you quite a bit of material today because it's a very diverse and complex and exciting field, this field of simulation aesthetics in ceramic. And in the 19th century, when there was the Palissy revival, you have artists like Jean-Charles Avisseau, who did quite extraordinary work where maybe he pushes the realism a bit too far and it doesn't have the charm and the quality of psychological effect that we get, in my opinion, in the work of Palissy himself. But the work is impressive for its complexity, its ambition, its richness of surface, and so on and so forth, but maybe it's a bit too much. Another artist working at the time in the 19th century is George Poole. That's an example of his work. The Barbizet factory in Paris, literally, dozens, if not hundreds of people all over Europe were making that type of ware in the 19th century. And it's a phenomenon that's still continuing today. Collins was another factory. Léon Brard. So it's interesting that they combine ceramic form with objects like fishes and all kinds of natural things that are imitated quite realistically in ceramics. And Alexandre Bigot moving away from naturalism, bringing it more at the level of material, the quality of glazes, and so on and so forth in his work. And in the contemporary world, we have an artist like Christine Viennet working in France as well, who is doing work following in the footsteps of Palissy and all the others in the 19th century who did such things. And here the work of Merriam Webster with Monsanto Pound. It's a contemporary piece made just a few years ago, very much in the Palissy style, but talking about ecological issues of pollution and all those things that are very current and contemporary to deal with now. So there are a variety of approaches to the simulation aesthetic. One would be the realist object, where an object in ceramic imitates another object, like here a shoe, but it doesn't make any sense for that object to be in ceramic. So it's not really a trompe-l'oeil. It's not trying to fool you to believe it is a real shoe. So the ceramicness of the object is very obvious from the get-go, like those cabbage pieces and all those fruits and vegetables we find. When we come across a cabbage teapot, we know it's not a cabbage because the teapot takes precedence in our mind as we read the object. But at the same time, it looks like a cabbage in a reasonably convincing way, and this is what could be called the realist object. The same thing here with this pineapple ware by Josiah Wedgwood. More Wedgwood ware, the wonderful cauliflower tureen with stand. So it's inspired by cauliflower at the level of form, at the level of texture and color and so on, but it's been translated into a profoundly ceramic object. So that creates a disjunction that is quite efficient. This is an example of Wedgwood Maiolica from the 1850s. And again, there is more on all those objects in the reading I'm assigning you this week. I'm just presenting you with a lot of material, like this Belleek basket or this coral teapot. Belleek is a company working in Ireland, still making those objects to this day. So by exposing you to a variety of objects and people and styles and things, you may find curiosity for some of them and research it further, which is my intention. So this is an example of fossil ware or agate ware imitating rocks and those types of things. Again, an example of marbling here by Wedgwood and Bentley from 1775, imitating marble, imitating metal, all of it in ceramics. This goes back in time very far. You have an example of faux granite, which is a type of rock, made in Egypt in 1400 BC, and one from England, agate ware made in the 1750s. Chelsea is a very interesting factory. It was the first British porcelain factory, and because of that, the work has a lot of flaws, mistakes, little pinholes and crawls and some things like that. So they would paint over the mistake small bugs or small flowers to hide them. And this is a form of imitation that is quite charming and very interesting, the way it embeds the mistake into the image and makes you forget about it. So Chelsea is one of the factories that did a lot of realist object in ceramics, like this Anne with her little chicks. And again, this was done all over Europe and then all over the world. There are still factories making that type of work today. And I'm just showing you some example from some factories or some cities like Strasbourg in France, who was famous for this type of ware. Wedgwood did something very interesting again around 1810 during the Napoleonic War, where there was a shortage of wheat in England, so they couldn't make pie. So he designed faux pastry meat pie dish, so that the ceramic looks like pie. It looks like pastry, basically, and then they would put whatever would be in the pastry in the dish and serve it as a table as if it was made out of pastry, although it was all ceramic. That's an interesting way to deal with a shortage of a material like wheat during war when actual pastry was rare. Then there is another very interesting category, maybe the more important one, which we could call the trompe-l'œil object, when the intention is to fool the eye, to make you think that something is something else, very realistically. And we have two examples here with peas in a dish and nuts in a dish, so that the nuts and the pea look so convincingly real that you feel like you can pick one up. But of course, they're all fused together ceramically as one thing. They're also fused to the plate. And so I ask myself, if the nuts are fake, is the plate real or is it also a fake plate? If the peas are the representation of peas, maybe the plate is not a real plate, but the representation of a plate as well. And that's quite a complex conceptual translation that happens here with those two things, the plate and the fruit, both behaving in a similar fashion of pretending they are something they're not. Examples from Sceaux in France and England. Those were parlor games. They would be presented to guests, and the guests would try to pick one up, and they could not, and much merriment would happen. And then you also have flowers. Beautiful flower compositions were created in porcelain in all kinds of ways and form all over Europe again, and all the way to today. We find examples of this. And those are examples of flowers and fruits and presentations. And of course, what happens now is that the permanency of ceramics, the fact that those flowers will never fade, those fruits will never rot, everything will remain the same for as long as humanity exists, basically. And this characteristic of the permanency of ceramic as an archival material is also very interesting to contemplate within the simulation aesthetics, to bring meaning and value to those objects. Why do such things, and what does it mean when you do such things, and how does it relate to time, to the passage of time, to mortality, and so on and so forth. So Maiolica is something I discuss in the reading as well, and I'm just showing you some example, and wonderful example from all over the world. This is a 19th century piece by the potter Kozan, made in Japan, with faux crabs. And fishes are very popular. This is an example by Picasso here, where he's not trying to fool the eye in any way. Everything looks totally materialized and the process is very obvious and so on. But he was looking at Palissy. The way the Portuguese factories still operating today were looking at Palissy and making imitation of his ware, and making all kinds of cabbage ware and strawberry ware and tomato ware and sunflower wares and so on and so forth. Portugal is probably the place in the 20th century and contemporarily that still makes those ware in vast quantities at Caldas de Rainha and at Cunha, two cities in Portugal. You find examples of that in Michoacan, Mexico as well, with pineapple ware. And Fornasetti in Italy designed 2D trompe-l'œil on ceramics. Those are they're not digitally printed, they're silk screen prints that are transferred to wares to give you the impression that there is a fish or cookies and biscuits on the plate, and then the plate can be used functionally for other purposes, of course. Example from Imari, Japan, and Jindaejian, China, incorporating fabrics, textiles, ribbons, and so on and so forth in ceramic material. And in the Mayan world, from pre-Columbian America, we have faux wood on the left and faux basket on the right, translated into ceramic forms. In China, glazers were sometimes emulating bronze at the level of form and at the level of surface as well. Not in a very convincing way, but there is still a relationship between the two materials that creates an interesting dynamic between them. And sometimes it would be pushed to a degree of realism, again a trompe-l'œil effect in those metal imitations. The two on the left from Qing, China, which is 19th century China, and the one on the right with the silver luster as an English teapot. And again, this permitted very expensive, pricey material to be used by more mundane people than the aristocracy and the emperor and the rich. Yixing ware from China is something I have brought up to you before in the classical aesthetics. It is again a wonderful way of imitating other material with clay and creating teapots with the process. So this is at the same time a realist object because it is nuts and fruits and vegetable parts becoming a teapot, but it is also trompe-l'œil because the illusion is so efficient that one feels that those mushrooms are real. Example from Yixing, China again, by Chen Mingwan in the 18th century and Wang Zhiyuan in the 19th century, because Yixing ware is often signed by the maker and the artist who composed the object, and those are two important artists of Yixing ware in China. And then I've brought up the issue before that Yixing ware, when brought to Europe, was very influential in the development of Meissen ceramics and Meissen porcelain, and those are two imitations of Yixing ware with an European sensibility. Example from Sèvres in France, this fennel tea set by Léon Kahn, made at Sèvres in porcelain. And again, example of imitation surfaces in ceramics with this card game on porcelain from Dupaquier in Vienna. There is so many different ways to approach the aesthetic. This is an example from China, an example from Portugal, where a leaf becomes part of the ceramic object in an interesting way. And this very beautiful example from France in the 19th century again, with those little animals crawling over leaves. I bring up the work of Thomas Wedgwood from 1790. Thomas Wedgwood was the son of Josiah Wedgwood, the celebrated ceramic industrialist who makes his presence felt in basically all those presentations in some way or other. And it is believed that he was the first photographer and the first to make a photograph. And this is an example of this work. So this is another form of imitating nature, of capturing the likeness of nature in photography. And he was doing this for the aim of putting interesting new surfaces on the work of his father, the celebrated potter and industrialist. But he died very young, and his invention was not rediscovered for a while still. Another aspect of the simulation aesthetic I want to bring up is that of fakes, when things look like the work of someone but they're not. And Ogata Kenzan, another very important artist who makes his presence felt regularly in those presentations, is a case in point. Ogata Kenzan was a very celebrated 18th century potter in Japan, and then he had many followers all the way to today actually, who make work in his style and inspired by his great approach to pottery making. But those two examples I'm showing you are fakes that were done later on in imitation of his style. The two examples I'm showing you now are by Ogata Kenzan, their original that he made himself in the 18th century, and those are on the left Sano Kenzan, which were made to fool collectors at the beginning of the 20th century and quite successfully. And then you have a follower of Kenzan, Ogata Shigekichi Kenzan VI, who was simply a follower of him and made work without trying to fool anyone that they were original, although they're very close to the original. Those are again examples of Sano Kenzan made in the 20th century with illegal aims of fooling collectors to buy this work for huge amount of money when they were actually not original work. And I find those works still very beautiful, very charming, and the fact that they are fakes is not necessarily detrimental to our aesthetic appreciation of them, although their market value is greatly undermined. Shell and underwater themes are also a very popular aspect of ceramic simulation. This is an example from Chelsea from 1755. Tiffany in New York with octopuses and vegetables here. It goes back all the way to Greece or to Japan, and as far back as the Yomon period, which is the prehistory of Japan in Neolithic times. So shell are a very important subject of inquiry in ceramic form as well. This is a beautiful swan tea set made at Colport in England in the 19th century. This wonderful example in early Italian porcelain at Capo di Monte, now at the Art Institute of Chicago, with corals and shells and all kinds of references to underwater. An example of Maiolica made by Fielding in 1855. And then, of course, as with all the other aesthetics we have discussed, there is a simulation aspect to the simulation aesthetics. And sometimes the form is an ordinary form, like a plate or a teapot, but the surface is simulating something else, like wood and prints and even little tacks holding the print to the wood. At Nidervillers, at Tournai in France, this was particularly popular in France, and it's a beautiful use of ceramic surfaces to create an illusion. An example from Sèvres again, and from Vienna on the right. Some example from China and from English ceramic, those tools in the 19th century. All of it made in ceramics, but in the way to make you believe it is out of wood. Example from China and from France again. So it is quite interesting that this approach to surface is also found in the simulation aesthetic. And a very perverse aspect of contemporary pottery making is all of those plastic faux oribe and faux chino ceramics we find in Japanese restaurants. And I find it quite interesting that this translation has been made where an object that appears to be handmade, appears to be thrown, appears to be hand painted, is all in plastic, and it imitates ceramics quite convincingly, but in a much cheaper way, and of course then unbreakable and much more convenient. A beautiful example here of a trompe-l'oeil surface with shells and corals, and then faux marble, faux bronze, all of it coming together on a porcelain object made at Worcester in England in the 19th century. One of the most extreme examples of the simulation aesthetic, and something I have brought up before in other contexts and will again later, are life-size reproductions of famous artworks on ceramic tiles made by Oni Factory, Japan, for the Otsuka Museum of Art in Naruto City, Japan. And you have here The Last Judgment by Michelangelo, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, translated to ceramic tiles in an absolutely realistic and convincing way. And those objects, of course, can then be installed outside. They can be rained on, snowed on. They will not be affected by weathering, and they will probably survive the original in Italy by centuries. So there are all kinds of very interesting examples of the use of simulation and illusion in ceramic. There is a stitched vase on the left, and Parisian ware, which is a type of ware imitating marble, made in England in the 19th century. Another category I will bring up very briefly is the surreal object, because one doesn't find examples of it readily in the history of ceramic, but quite a few of them in contemporary ceramics, which is not the aim of this presentation specifically, but I want to bring to your attention the work of Meret Oppenheim and her Breakfast in Furs from 1930, where the transformation of an ordinary ceramic object has become a surreal experience. Then there is ceramics imitating ceramics, which is a very interesting category in itself. And quite an interesting research could be done on that phenomenon. Here you have on the left an earthenware example from Iran imitating a porcelain example from Song, China. And those were more or less made at the same time. The porcelain from China was brought to Iran. The potters of Iran found it very beautiful and tried to imitate it and made this reasonably convincing version in earthenware at the time. Two other examples from Song, China on the left and from Iran on the right, where you can see clearly how one inspired the other and how one is trying to imitate the other, although they are made around the same time in very different countries with very different materials. And there is a tremendous amount of those cultural exchange happening in the world of ceramic. This is another beautiful example from Iran from around 1700, when everybody outside China was trying to find the secret of porcelain, and this is an early attempt made in Iran for that purpose. Those are more recent examples of sequoia pottery from the USA, probably from the 1940s or 50s. And those objects are slip cast and they imitate handmade objects. They are glazed and they imitate burnished objects which are not glazed originally in their original inspiration. So there is all kinds of, again, of reversal from hand building to slip casting, from unglazed to glazed, in order to imitate something by doing something quite different than the original would have done. This is, sorry for the poor quality of the image, but it's scanned from a poor source. This is an imitation Mimbres platter made in the USA in 1960, and you must be a bit more familiar with Mimbres by now, because again, this is a style and a type of ceramics that makes its presence regularly in those presentations. And to complete my talk, this is two contemporary examples by Richard Millet from Montreal, where the form are imitative. The one on the left of Asian ginger wares, the one on the right of a Baroque teapot from European sources. The metal is an imitation, the faux black leather is an imitation, and all the broken shards reassembled to recompose the form are imitations of various ceramic surfaces from the history of the field from all over the world. Thank you, and see you next week.